Today we're going to take a piece of this, combine it with a little bit of this, and make a chessboard that looks like this. Come on, I'll show you how. Welcome back and thanks for joining me. On today's show we're going to make an epoxy and walnut chessboard. The size of chess table that I'm going to make are going to have 2 1/4 inch squares. For the end grain to work for this, I need it to be at least 2 1/4 inches thick. The goal with this chessboard is to have squares of end grain walnut surrounded by squares of purple epoxy. So I'm not really sure how this is going to turn out. It's going to be an adventure, so let's get started. The first thing I want to do is cut some strips out of this board so that are a little over 2 1/4 inches width. That'll give me some blanks to work with that I can plane down to start cutting out the squares for the chessboard. In order to get enough blanks so that I can cut them about 1.5 inches thick, the thickness of our chessboard, I want to lay out how much wood I need to cut off the end of this board. After doing some measurements, I can get about 4 blanks out of this piece of wood. I need 48 inches just to make my 1.5 inch thickness for each square. For this, I'm going to actually go ahead and cut it 16 inches long so that I leave each square a little bit proud. So when I pour the epoxy and I sand it down, I've got some wiggle room to work with in each square. This is a really thick, heavy board and it doesn't quite fit on my miter saw all the way. It doesn't need to be precise. For this cut, I'm just going to use my circular saw, go through as much as I can on one pass, flip the board over and complete the other side. Now that I've got my board cut to length, I'll cut some blanks out of it at about 2 5/8 inches wide. Next, I'm going to run each blank through my thickness planer until it's just under 2 1/4 inch length by width. More on why I want that to be under 2 1/4 inch here in a little bit. Okay, I have my stop block set up about 1 5/8 inch away from the saw blade here. And now I'll just cut my blanks and that will create the end grain for the walnut portion of the chessboard. Now I'll just chop up 32 of these. And just like that, perfect stack of expensive walnut building blocks. Next, I'm just going to sand each one of these with a little 120 grit sandpaper to knock off the edges. I think I laid these out the way I want. On these ones in this triangle portion and this triangle portion over here, I just did a random grain pattern, but I did have some pieces that clearly had some more sapwood on them, and I tried to line them up so it'll make a nice stripe down the center of the board. I'm gonna have wooden end grain walnut squares, and then in between here, I'm gonna fill this with epoxy resin. So the next thing I need to do is create a mold, figure out some way to hold these in place while I pour the epoxy resin and let it cure. Each square is 2 1/4 inches length by width, so that means if I need 8 squares across, that's 18 by 18. However, I'm going to add a 1/2 inch to that measurement to make sure I have a 1/4 inch all the way around that I can cut off at a later time. Next, I'm going to rip down a spare piece of plywood to 2 7/16 inches wide. The reason I'm going to do that is because I'm going to use this to create the grid on the base of the epoxy mold. The next thing I'm doing is just making sure my mold is absolutely square before I start this next process. What I'm going to do is measure in 1/4 inch from this side and score a line, and 1/4 inch from this side and score a line all the way down. From there, I'll use the template I just made and I'll draw my grid out on this plywood base for my epoxy mold. Next, I'm going to take a piece of plywood and I'm going to score some lines and work my way all the way across the board. I'll need 8 rows in total, lengthwise and widthwise, to create my grid. I'm actually going to do these in a Sharpie. I want the thick line of the Sharpie to be my 1/16 inch gap between each of my wooden squares. This will also allow me to see my grid lines when I coat this with the tuck tape. Because this is the edge that I referenced when creating this grid this way, I'm just going to take a square and make sure that as I'm drawing these lines, perpendicular to the rest of the grid to keep it from getting out of square. You can see that by making the jig just a little bit smaller and using the thickness of the Sharpie line, each block just barely fits inside of its spot on the board. And when you look at this, you can see there's about 1/8 of an inch gap between all of these that will allow the epoxy to flow right through to the empty spaces, creating a unique look for this board. I'm going to take all these blocks off, and then I'm going to cover this board in the Tyvek tape. Okay, I've got the Tyvek tape on the bottom of my mold. This will help prevent the epoxy from sticking to my mold when I go to pry it out. But you can see the other reason why I decided to go with a Sharpie. Not only does it give me the little spacing that I want, about a 1/16 of an inch in between each cube, but I can also see it through the Tyvek tape when I go to lay these out. Now, I haven't put the edges on my mold yet. One reason for that is as I'm laying out my pieces, I'm going to use a straight edge to make sure that I get all the pieces straight across as I'm placing this in the mold. The wood is going to want to float in the epoxy. So the next thing I need to do is figure out how I'm going to temporarily attach each wooden cube to the bottom of this mold so it doesn't float as I pour the epoxy and as the epoxy cures. Okay, so I've tried out a few methods. I tried to just put a little CA on a scrap piece of wood and glue it directly to this Tyvek Tech tape. But when I did that, of course, if epoxy is not going to stick to the tuck tape, neither is the CA glue. The pieces were just popping off too easy. So I'm going to go with the painter's tape method. A lot of times you'll see people use blue tape for this. I'm plumb out of blue tape. I'm using green tape. The idea is that everywhere that a wooden piece is going to go in the epoxy, I'm putting a piece of green tape. I'll put a piece of green tape on the back of each wooden piece that goes in each corresponding spot. I'll put a little bit of CA glue on one piece, a little accelerator on the other piece, and that should hold it down good enough where the pieces won't float when I pour the epoxy. At least that's the hope. Here I'm just putting a little piece on the back of each wooden block. All right, now it's time to start gluing these down. I've clamped a straight edge straight across the piece to make sure I at least have one line of reference when I go to glue these blocks in place. I'll put a little bit of CA glue on the back of each block and a little bit of accelerator down on the board, and I only have a few seconds to make sure that this lined up perfectly, hold it in place so that it won't float when I pour the epoxy. Let's give it a try. I think that's going to hold it in place just fine. Now just a few more to do. This is what it looks like now that we got all the pieces glued on. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Everything's on there nice and solid. The next thing I'm going to do is rip down some pieces of plywood that'll be the frame for this. Then we can finally pour our epoxy. Next, I ripped down some sides for my mold that are just proud of the finished thickness of this here. I'll go ahead and cover these with tuck tape, and then I'm going to put them on the mold and I'll screw them into place. All right, I absolutely don't want this mold to leak, so I'm going to go a little overkill here. I've got some caulk, just some regular, dries in 30 minutes, white caulk. I'm going to caulk the inside seam on each side piece of my mold. Clamp this in place. The caulk is squeezing out right there in the middle. I'm going to pre-drill some holes and secure each side in with some 2-inch screws. Once I get all the sides in place, I'll actually come back and put another bead of caulk on the inside of this whole mold to make sure that it's sealed from each edge and from the inside. One other quick note. When I'm caulking the edge for this piece, it's going to overlap here, so I'll also caulk each edge of this. And then I'll caulk the inside of each corner too once the mold is fully assembled. I have my mold complete. I've got everything caulked. I've got everything taped. I'll let it dry for a couple hours before I start the pour. For this pour, I'm using liquid glass deep pour epoxy. And for the color, I'm using eye candy, and I'm going with a purple color because that is my nephew Joe's favorite color, and this is going to be his chessboard. What I came up with is that I'm going to need a little over a gallon of epoxy for this pour. For this pour, I'm going to start with 3 quarts. Doing a 3-quart pour will be a little bit easier, and it'll ensure that I'm not wasting product. Deep pour epoxy is very viscous, so I did make sure that my mold is perfectly level in both directions before I pour. Right at 2 quarts of resin. 1 quart of reactive agent. Then we'll add our purple pigment. That looks about right. If I don't like the color, I can always add more. I'm not worried about being too dark. I'm worried about it being too light. I've got my drill here, my mixer on it, and I'll simply mix this for about 5 minutes. Since I did this pour in a few different pours, I'm just going to use a popsicle stick and swirl it up and make sure everything's mixed up nice and good. And then we'll take a blowtorch to it to pop all the micro bubbles. I'll also repeat this process every 3 or 4 hours at first. Because this is a deep pour epoxy, it is going to cure very slowly and allow these bubbles to slowly seep out of the epoxy. And so I want to make sure that I get around the edges really good to eliminate any air bubbles in my final product. All right, it's been about 12 hours and the epoxy keeps settling because it's very slow curing. So what I'm doing to get the effect that I want is just taking a stick and swirling it in the epoxy to give it that look. You can see the difference between the ones I've done this with and the ones that I haven't done this with. I'm trying to be very careful with this to make sure that I don't introduce new air bubbles into the epoxy as well. This has been curing for about 6 days now. It seems pretty hard. I'm going to unscrew the screws and take this out of the mold and see how we did. It's like Christmas morning. All right, moment of truth. Let's see how this is going to work out. Oh, it came off pretty easy. The Tyvek tape on there worked pretty well. This one's being a little bit more stubborn. So that just came off pretty easy. Now I just got to see if I can get this bottom piece off.
Hurry up!
All right, it came off the mold. I don't know if that painter's tape's gonna stick on there or not, but we'll find out. It did get under the very thin gap that was left between these 2 layers of painter's tape. So from there, I'm just gonna try to get as much of this green tape off the back as I can. Then we're gonna take this and smooth it down on the router sled. The next thing I need to do is get this flat and level. To use this, I'm just gonna use a router planer, and I'll just take about 1/8 of an inch off with each pass with my router as I go back and forth until I get a nice smooth surface on the top. This actually worked out pretty well, but I did learn some very valuable lessons with my first router sled experience. First of all, it's a mess. It creates a lot of mess, and I'm going to spend the next 2 days vacuuming. The other thing is, because of the rotation of the bit, I found it easier to pull my router through the piece this way each time. So I start at the top and go to the bottom, and then I come back up before moving my sled over. The other thing I found is that my bit seemed to cut better if I moved it in this direction versus this direction. So I started at this end, made all my cuts, went down, back up, moved my sled over, down and up, moved my sled over, down and up until I was done. That's what worked best for me. Oh, and one last thing, I adjusted the speed on my router too. I think it was up just a little bit too high for the size bit I have. When you're looking at router bits, the smaller bit want a higher speed. The bigger bits want a slower speed. Just make sure you take a little bit of time to get your router dialed in on your sled, and take shallow passes at first so that you're not taking out big chunks that you can't repair later. Next thing I'm going to do is sand. There's some tooling marks left over from the router sled, of course. I might start with a 60 or 80 grit, something pretty aggressive to start the sanding process. I'll go up to 320 and evaluate from there. I do have a pretty nice day outside today, so I'm going to do this outside. Sanding epoxy does get pretty messy and it gums up the sandpaper pretty quick, so I'll have to be sure to try to keep my surface clean and my sandpaper clean as I get through the grits. Okay, I've got the top and the bottom very rough sanded. Before I go too much further, I'm going to trim this down to size. I'm just going to run this through my table saw until I only have about 1/8 of an inch of the purple epoxy showing on each side. Next, I'm going to put a slight bevel all the way around on all 4 corners just to make the board a little bit easier to pick up when it's laying flat. I picked 24 degrees for this for no particular reason other than I like the number 24. And here's what that edge looks like when it's done. You can see it leaves a nice cool pattern on the edge of wood and epoxy where the wood just barely pokes through. And as the case is with most things that I make, I'm going to use my Makita router with my 1/8 inch roundover bit and just put a nice soft edge around the top. Now I'll just take my time and continue sanding, making sure that I don't skip any grits in between, that I get a consistent swirl mark in my wood and my epoxy, and then I just take my time and really make sure to keep this nice and flat. Oh, and one other tip, the reason I like to do my routing early in the sanding process is because the router can leave this little mark where it goes over the wood. So if you do it early, you'll be able to sand that out pretty easy. It's more like a scuff, but if you wait until the end, you'll be sanding that out again. One thing to note, as I'm sanding this with the 60 and 80 grit, I am using my DeWalt sander. The reason for that is it has a little bit more aggressive sanding pattern. Once I get to my 120 grit and above, I'll switch to my Festool sander, which has a much finer grit. The other reason I'm using my DeWalt sander for this is a complete mess. Since this is just an old sander I've had laying around, it's got a little bit more aggressive style, and I'm using a little bit more aggressive sandpaper. It's really the tool for the job. One last thing I forgot to mention while I'm sanding, I am being a little bit more sporadic. Usually I go in a nice pattern, back and forth, diagonal, crisscross, what have you. For this, I'm kind of moving to different areas in the board. I don't want the sandpaper to heat up this epoxy and start to gouge into it or make it warp in any way. So do a little bit here, do a little bit here, do a little bit here. Just kind of keep it moving around more than maybe you would with a standard wood piece. I sanded this down to 80 grit and then I just wiped it off with a little bit of mineral spirits. I don't want to switch grits until I have a nice, even swirl pattern and consistent haze across the entire top of the board. If you try to switch when you're sanding too quick, you'll leave marks from the last grit that become increasingly harder to get out as you go up and grit. I'm going through my sanding process and I've got a couple of little spots on the edge where I think I had some air bubbles in my epoxy, not a big deal. Here's one here, it's kind of hard to see. I want to smooth that out. I'm not going to use epoxy for that, I'm actually going to use CA glue. So what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of CA glue, a little bitty tiny dab, fill that spot in, take some activator, spray it, let it set for a minute or two, I'll sand it down flat. I'll repeat that process for any other little nicks on the edge of the board. Next, I'll sand this down, and you'll never know it's there. And one last sanding note, I did move over to my Festool and this Abernet sandpaper. This sandpaper tends not to clog as bad as a regular sandpaper because it's a mesh for this type of sanding, especially with epoxy, seems to work really well. I've been sanding this for a few hours now. I started at 40 grit and I've worked my way up to 220. I am going to touch this up just a little bit with some 320 to finish it off. I'm going to finish this with Rubio Monocoat, so 220 is all I really need to go to. However, I want to make sure that I get a really nice, consistent swirl grain with my sandpaper, and 320 just gives it a little bit better look. Next, I'm going to wipe down the board really good and get it clean with some mineral spirits. This is going to do two things. It's going to allow me to get it nice and clean and then give it one last final inspection to see if I have any scratches or swirl marks in here that I need to take the sander back to before I finish it. I'll give this a quick inspection and I'll let it dry. So for this application, we're using Rubio Monocoat. This is a product I really like to use for a few reasons. First, it's really tough, it's really durable, fairly easy to repair a spot if you get a place that gets stretched or beat up. If you have to sand it down and reapply finish at some point, it should be fairly easy. I'm going to start on the back here. The way that I like to apply this is just dribble a little bit on. A little bit of this goes a long way. You don't have to use a whole lot. I'll use a wooden stick to spread it around a little bit. Another reason I like to use this, as the name implies, monocoat. It only takes one coat. I don't have to do multiple applications, sanding in between or anything like that. It works really well with epoxy and it really makes this walnut pop. After I spread a little bit around, I like to take a piece of a white buffing pad and just buff it in. You really want it to get into the pores of the wood. With this particular finish, less is actually more. Don't want to add a whole lot to your piece, because after we're done buffing this in and making sure that we've got it into all the pores of the wood, we're actually going to then wipe it off until it feels dry. And you can see how it just makes that pop. We'll go ahead and get the edges. And I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's some places that are a lot drier than others. And so if I see that dry area, I'll just continue to buff in a little more of the product. You know, I don't have to wear a mask or anything to apply it. I don't need some special spray booth or anything like that. No special equipment. For these smaller pieces, the white buffer pad works really well. After a few minutes, it starts becoming sticky. Once you make it, you have about 15 minutes to work on your area. Now I'm just going to take some shop towels and I'm going to wipe off all the extra product. And this is one place with this product where you can actually make a mistake. You can actually leave too much product on and not wipe enough off. You want to keep buffing and rubbing it out until it becomes slick and smooth, almost like it's dry. If it's still tacky or sticky, then you haven't wiped enough off yet. All right, that's feeling pretty good. You can see my paper towel is just moving over it really easily, like it's dry. So we'll flip it over and we'll do the same procedure on the top. All right, I'm just gonna keep buffing this. Next thing we'll do is put some rubber feet on the bottom of this so it doesn't slide around on a table or wherever it's gonna be played. And then we'll get into the final product and see what it looks like. And I'll tell you a couple of things that I would do differently next time. This board's had about 24 hours to dry. I'm really happy with the results. The last thing I want to do to complete this is get some feet on the back. And for this, I'm just going to use these rubber feet. They come with some stainless steel screws. They're typically used for cutting boards. Since I want the feet to go in the wood, I'm not going to be able to perfectly line these up in a square. I'm going to have to offset them a little bit just to get them where I want them. But I do not want to put the screws into the epoxy. I don't want to risk cracking it. Plus, I don't want you to be able to see the screw through the epoxy. I'll make a mark where I want each of these to go, and I'll use my drill to just get the hole started. I'll take my screw and I'll put it in there, screw them in place. I'll repeat that with the other three. And with those installed, I think we can call this project done. Love the way these edges turned out. You can see the epoxy and the wood showing through. All right, we're gonna call this a wrap, but I did want to show you a few things that I may change if I were to do this again, or some tips and tricks that I could give you that I learned while doing this that could help you while you're making yours. First of all is the back. The back on this didn't turn out extremely great. You can see there's some discoloration in the walnut. The reason for that is when I use the CA glue and painter's tape to hold these blocks down when I poured the epoxy, it actually let the epoxy seep into the wood in some areas and not the other. Now, one solution for this would be keep going over it with the router sled until I get a nice consistent wood finish on the bottom. However, I wanted to keep this as thick as possible, so I elected to just leave it discolored. Another thing you could do is actually dip each block in a little bit of epoxy and then stick it to the board where you want. Let it cure a little bit, and that should be enough to hold this down. Some other things you could do are a different edge, or I've seen other boards online where they build a frame around this. Now, I really wanted the epoxy to be the star of the show here, so I didn't elect to put a walnut frame around it. Those are just a couple of things that you could think about or change on your next one. Overall, this turned out amazing. Joe, I hope you're really gonna enjoy this and win a lot of games on it. Thanks for watching. Do as the shirt says. Talk to you later.